The land that no one wanted cost him $4. Not because it was worth $4, because that was everything he had. Welcome to the Countryside Tales channel. This is the story of Aurelio Vega, a man who arrived at a dead ranch with an empty pocket and a name no one remembered, and found, at the bottom of a dry well, something that would make every man who had dismissed him wish he had kept his mouth shut. There are places in Zacatecas that the road forgets, stretches of high plateau where the wind moves through the mesquite, and the only sound is the far-off bell of a goat that wandered too close to the ravine. In those places, a man can disappear completely, or he can begin again from nothing. Aurelio Vega had always believed there was a difference between the two. He was 26 years old when he found out he was right. His parents died the same year, 4 months apart. His mother first, in February, from a fever that the village doctor said was nothing and that turned out to be everything. His father in June, from grief, though the death certificate said something about the lungs. Aurelio buried them both in the small cemetery at the edge of the ejido, paid for the crosses himself by selling the 2 goats his father had kept, and found himself standing on the road with a leather sack and no door left in the world that had his name on it. The house his parents had rented for 30 years was not theirs to inherit. The landlord, a man named Cipriano Ochoa, who lived in Fresnillo and came to collect his money once a month like a clock, appeared 1 week after the father's burial with a man and a truck. "I'm sorry for your loss," Cipriano said. He was not sorry. "But the property reverts to me." Aurelio asked for 2 weeks to find somewhere to go. Cipriano gave him 5 days. The man with the truck waited in the cab with the engine running, as if Aurelio might argue. He didn't argue. He packed what fit in the leather sack: his father's old journal, his mother's rosary, a wool blanket, and a change of clothes, and walked out. A neighbor woman named Rosenda, who had known his mother for 20 years, stood in her doorway and watched him go. She crossed herself. She did not call out to him. That silence was its own kind of cruelty. What Cipriano Ochoa did not know, what no one in that village would know until much later, was that on the morning he handed Aurelio his 5-day notice, he had already set into motion something he could not take back. Aurelio walked north for 3 days along the high plateau road. He had $4 in his shirt pocket, a folded piece of newspaper with a notice torn from a wall in the village, and the address of a land office in a town called Tepequitan. The notice said, "Abandoned property, Rancho El Solzal, 1 hectare with structures. Sale for back taxes owed. Minimum bid accepted." He didn't know what minimum bid meant. He found out at the land office that it meant $4, the exact amount of accumulated back taxes no one had bothered to pay in 11 years. He also found out that no one else had shown up to bid. The clerk behind the counter, a young woman with ink on her fingers, looked at him over her glasses when he counted out the $4 in coins and small bills. "You know the well is dry," she said. It was the only thing she said. She stamped the paper. Aurelio walked the 6 kilometers from the town to Rancho El Solzal with the deed folded against his chest, inside his shirt, where he could feel it with every breath. The rancho was 3 crumbling adobe walls, a shed with half a roof, and a corral where the fence posts had mostly fallen. The mesquite and huizaque had come in from all sides, thick and thorny. There was a pila, a stone water basin, cracked down the center, and at the far end of the property, past an old Sabino tree that had somehow survived, there was the well. It was stone-rimmed, old, with a wooden crossbeam over the top that the weather had turned silver. Aurelio dropped a small rock into it. He didn't hear it hit water. He heard it hit stone. Dry, just like the clerk said. He stood there a long while in the late afternoon light, with the wind moving through the mesquite and the high plateau spread out around him in every direction. He had no water, no food, no tools, no help. He opened his father's leather journal to the first blank page, took out the stub of a pencil from his pocket, and wrote, Day 1. I own this. Then he walked back to the road to look for someone to talk to. He found Don Praxedis 3 kilometers down the track. The old man was sitting on an overturned bucket outside a jacal, sharpening a machete with a whetstone and the unhurried patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. He was small and lean, with hands that looked like they had been made from the same material as the land, dark, cracked, enduring. He didn't ask Aurelio's name first. He looked at the leather sack and the folded deed visible at the collar of his shirt and said, You bought El Solzal. Yes, sir, $4. Yes, sir, the old man kept sharpening the machete. Sit down, he said. There was no second chair. Aurelio sat on a stone. Don Praxedis. He gave the name the way old men do, as if it needed no last name to hold it up. Went inside and came out with a clay pot of beans and a piece of dried meat, and set them on the ground between them. He did not offer explanation or ceremony. He just set them down. That was the first kindness. Over the next 2 weeks, Don Praxedis arrived at the rancho every morning before the sun cleared the ridgeline, riding a gray mule he called Cenizo. The mule was old and deliberate and had the expression of an animal that had seen everything and was unimpressed. Aurelio grew fond of him immediately. Together they hauled the fallen fence posts upright and reset them in the ground. They patched the adobe of the south wall with mud and dry grass. They cleared the mesquite from the corral with machetes until their arms ached. Don Praxedis worked without complaint and without praise, which Aurelio came to understand was its own form of respect. The old man wasn't treating him like a charity case. He was treating him like a man who had a ranch to run. At noon they rested under the Sabino tree. Don Praxedis drank from a water skin and looked at the land the way a person looks at something they have known for a long time. This land had water once, he said one afternoon, on the 3rd day. The well is dry. The well is dry now. He looked toward the stone rim at the far end of the property. Your father's people had a saying, a well that went dry once went dry from above. It didn't go dry from below. Aurelio didn't understand. Don Praxedis didn't explain further. He stood up, brushed the dust from his trousers, and walked back to work. A week into their routine, a man appeared at the property gate. He was fat and well-dressed for the region, a belt with a large silver buckle, boots that hadn't seen mud in their life. He introduced himself as a representative of an agricultural enterprise based in Fresnillo. He did not give the name of the enterprise. He offered Aurelio $300 for the property, which he called a fair price for worthless land. He smiled when he said worthless. Aurelio said he'd think about it. The man said he'd be back in a week. He said it the way people say things when they expect to find the answer already given. That night, Aurelio sat by the well with his father's journal open in his lap. He read the entries from cover to cover for the first time, the small, careful notes his father had kept for years. Accounts of weather and animal prices, and brief observations about neighbors and God and the way the seasons worked. Near the back, in older ink, there were entries that weren't his father's handwriting. They were smaller, sharper, a different hand entirely. At the bottom of the last entry in that older script, there was a name, Augusto Vega, and below the name, a date from 1961, and below the date, a sentence that made Aurelio put the journal down and stare at the dark sky for a long time. In the hollow of the well's stone lining, On the east side, there is a folded paper that was going to change everything. One that would tell whoever came next what this land had always been worth. He lowered himself into the well the next morning at first light. Don Praxedes held the rope. He didn't ask questions. He braced his boots against the stone rim and held on with the steady grip of a man who has learned that you don't ask questions when the moment calls for action. The well was 8 meters deep. At the bottom, Aurelio's boots found not rock but damp clay. Recent damp. The kind that comes from water somewhere close, moving underground. On the east wall of the stone lining, exactly where the journal had said, there was a recess behind a loose stone. He pried the stone free. Behind it was an oilskin bundle tied with a cord. Don Praxedes pulled him up. They opened the bundle on the stone rim of the well in the morning light. Inside the oilskin was a surveyor's report. It was dated 1959. It bore the official seal of the Zacatecas State Land Commission and the signature of a registered hydraulic engineer. The report identified Rancho El Salzal as sitting directly above a subsurface aquifer, a deep freshwater deposit that the surveyor described, in measured technical language, as sufficient to supply a substantial agricultural enterprise or a rural community of several hundred families for a generation or more. The well, the report noted, had been improperly cased in its upper section, which had caused the surface channel to divert. The fix, the engineer wrote, was straightforward for anyone with the right tools and 3 days' work. Below the surveyor's report was a second document, a letter from Aurelio's great-grandfather, Augusto Vega, addressed to my sons and their sons after them. The letter said that he had commissioned the survey with money he saved over 10 years of working other men's land, that he had hidden the report because he feared the large landowners in the region would find a way to take the property if they knew what lay beneath it, that the land was theirs, that it had always been theirs, and that the water under it was a gift he was leaving them for when they needed it most. Don Praxedes read the letter twice. Then he took off his hat. "Your great-grandfather was a careful man," he said quietly. Aurelio held the papers and felt a cold move through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. He thought about his father, who had lived and died in a rented house 60 kilometers from this land, who had never known, who had kept this journal without knowing what was written in the back of it, in his own grandfather's hand. A second neighbor, a woman from the nearest hamlet who had come to bring them lunch wrapped in a cloth, stood at the gate and witnessed the moment. She set the food down without a word and crossed herself. The man with the silver belt buckle came back the following Thursday, as he had promised, with a different man, younger, with a briefcase, who introduced himself as a lawyer. Aurelio was at the well when they arrived. He had spent the previous 3 days with Don Praxedes and 2 hired men from Tepoztlán recasing the upper section of the well, following the engineer's instructions from the 1959 report exactly. That morning, water had come up. Clear, cold, deep water that tasted like something that had been saved up for a long time. He was filling a clay jug from the well when the 2 men arrived. The man with the silver buckle looked at the water and went still. "We'd like to revise our offer," the lawyer said, opening the briefcase. Aurelio set the jug down on the stone rim of the well and dried his hands on his trousers. "This land," he said, "belonged to my great-grandfather Augusto Vega. The surveyor's report that establishes the aquifer is dated 1959 and registered with the State Land Commission. I have the original. The notary in Tepoztlán has a certified copy. The property was sold for tax debt because no one in my family knew where the land was or what it was worth, but the title was always ours, and the water beneath it has always been ours." He picked up the jug. "I'm not selling." The lawyer looked at his client. The client looked at the well. The water in the jug caught the light of the afternoon sun and held it. "There are other ways too," the lawyer began. Don Praxedis stepped forward from where he had been standing beside Saniso at the corral fence. He was still small, still unhurried. He looked at the lawyer with the patience of a man who has nothing left to fear. "There are no other ways," he said. "Not here." The lawyer closed his briefcase. The two men left, without ceremony. The sound of their truck faded into the high plateau until there was nothing but the wind and the mesquite, and for the first time in 11 years, the faint sound of water moving through stone. By autumn, the cattle had come back to Rancho El Solzal. Aurelio had leased water rights to 2 neighboring rancheros at a fair price, enough to keep the land solvent and restore the main adobe structure into a proper house with 4 walls and a full roof. He had repaired the pila, which now held clean water and reflected the sky. He had built a small granary beside the corral where the old fence posts had stood. He had planted a row of manzano trees along the north edge of the property, still young, still thin, but pointing upward with the persistence of things that intend to last. Don Praxedis came every morning still, riding Saniso down the track from his jacal, though now he came for coffee rather than labor. He sat in the shade of the Sabino tree and drank from a clay cup and watched the land with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has seen a thing come right. One morning he arrived to find Aurelio standing at the well, not drawing water, just standing at the rim with his hand on the old wooden crossbeam, looking down. "What are you thinking about?" the old man asked. Aurelio was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking about my father. That he never knew." Don Praxedis sat down on the stone rim beside him. He was quiet too, for a while. "He knew something," the old man said finally. "He kept the journal. He didn't throw it away. A man who keeps a thing he doesn't understand yet is a man who believes it might matter later." Aurelio nodded. At dusk, the cattle came in from the grazing land on their own, slow, heavy, fattened from the season's grass, moving through the gate in single file as the last light turned the Sierra to copper. Saniso stood at the corral fence and watched them with his old, unimpressed eyes. The bell on the gate rang as each animal passed through. Sometimes that is how the most important things arrive, not announced, not explained, but quietly, at the end of a long day, finding their way home on their own. Aurelio Vega did not set out to restore his family's land. He set out to survive, but the land had been waiting for someone who would not look away from a dry well and call it worthless. The water was always there. It was the person willing to go down and look who was hard to find. Has anyone ever believed in you just when you were starting to doubt your own worth? If this story moved you, leave your comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and share this with someone who is standing in front of something that looks empty but might not be. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single story. Give us a like and turn on the bell. Until the next story, a heart-to-heart embrace from Countryside Tales. And they say in Tepoztlán that the water from the well at El Sauzal tastes different from any other water in the region. Cleaner, colder, with something in it that no one has ever been able to name exactly, though everyone who drinks it says the same thing, that it tastes like something that was saved up for a long time, waiting for the right person to find it.